no, sorry, chapter 3. We were on chapter 3. Okay. So chapter 3 is about a bunch of things, right? Chapter 3 is about King Philip's War. Chapter 3 is about Bacon's Rebellion. Chapter 3 is about the English Civil War. And I don't know. I know this period, and I found that chapter confusing. So I want to talk a little bit about what's some deep background in European history, not because Europe is the center of everything, but because it's helpful to understand what's going on in Britain with the Protestant Reformation and the English Civil War. It really helps explain a bunch of the things that distinguish the northern and southern colonies in this period. So the big question today is, how did the Protestant Reformation, hey everybody, good morning. How did the Protestant Reformation change? Uh-oh. Why is my screen freezing? Oh no. You are not doing this to me. PowerPoint. You are killing me, PowerPoint. Okay, you can see the PowerPoint, right? But I can't page down. Oh, I hate Microsoft products. Okay. I might have to reboot my PowerPoint because PowerPoint is going to drive me crazy. Bear with me here for a second. I don't want to kill everything. Why is PowerPoint not working? All right. I'm going to kill it. I'm going to rebuild it. PowerPoint pain. Yeah, document recovery. No shit. Okay. There we go. Now I can page down. Gee, how many crickets. Sorry, I didn't mean to curse at you guys first thing in the morning. I wasn't cursing at you. I was cursing at PowerPoint, which is driving me nuts. I'm myself a Linux user primarily, but I don't know. Once you start like so much, what's it called? The Territory Ahead is where I love to get my shirts from. It's named after a Mark Twain story. But yeah, PowerPoint deserves to be cursed at, but there we are. And did I break all my? I did. Okay. All right, I'm gonna have to quit and start again. I can't believe you deleted the file that I've been working on for hours and oh, there we are. Did you break my file? Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. I can't believe this. I was up all last night and this morning building these files up, and now they're all gone. Okay. All right. We are in the 17th century. All right. I want to talk today about the big question of how the Protestant Reformation changed England and understanding the English Civil War. To begin with, we should point out that the settlers are vastly outnumbered by native peoples in this period. The numbers don't meet until the time of the American Revolution. That is, there are more native peoples in North America than there are colonists until 1776. The overview question again is, how did the Protestant Reformation change England? What is the English Civil War, and what's its big background? Does that make sense? So that's the overview question. All right. So unfortunately for the 17th century, we have very few written documents. And for women's diaries, for example, all we have are captivity stories. And for men, we have sermons, diaries, and things like that. Leaders who may have had something useful to say about everyone's life, but we might not be willing to trust them entirely. But we need to understand a little bit about the Puritans and the Pilgrims. So this is an image from the English Civil War. If you look on the left here, we've got one group of people, and the right is another. What are different about the two people? Who's oh shoot? Are you guys? Why do you not see what I see? Okay, I've got two copies of PowerPoint open now. There we are. Okay, take a look at this image. All right, who's on the left and who's on the right? What's different about those folks? Guys on the left have better hair. Lots of long hair versus short hair. Okay. The left folks are taller, maybe. Even the dogs. Okay. The hair. The left have boots. Excellent. And they have puppies. Shoes. The guys on the right barely have faces. Okay. What about the beards? What can we say about the beards? The guys on the right have pointy beards, right? Yeah, or no beards. The right has a Hanseatic haircut. Excellent. Right. One side hit puberty and the other one didn't. Okay. Better dog names. Pepper is uninspired. Bite and Pepper. Poodle is a better name. Spurs on their boots. Okay. So on the left are cavaliers. Okay. And so the person on the right is saying cavalier dog, right? Bite him, Pepper. So this is the people on the left are cavaliers, and the people on the right are roundheads, the people with the Hanseatic haircuts. Okay, and this is cavalier and roundhead, and this conflict between cavalier left looks like they have fancier dinners. The cavaliers on the left are people who are going to be associated with the king, particularly Charles the First. And the people on the right are going to be people who oppose the king and support a commonwealth. Oh, right. Excellent. And the dogs have the same haircuts as the people. Okay. There's a kind of a Van Dyke beard on the right, which is a Dutch beard. The Van Dyke beard is that little kind of pointy beard at the edge. This suggests the sort of Dutch background to some of these people. They aren't Dutch themselves, but they ally with the Dutch, who are again the Protestant reformers who have their own state and no king. Okay. Remember we talked about Queen Elizabeth? She's a Protestant. She faces down the Spanish Armada. Right. So the ones on the left support the king. The ones on the right oppose the king. The ones on the left are cavaliers who support the king. The ones on the right are Puritans who oppose the king. Right? And Puritans want to purify the English Bible, purify the Anglican Church. They believe that the English Bible is corrupted by Catholic sentiment, and the whole country needs to be purified. So these Puritans on the right are going to be the people who colonized New England, or the white people who colonized New England. The people on the left are the people who are going to colonize the American South, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. Yeah, and that's Charles the First. Okay, so we talked about Queen Elizabeth, how she faced the Spanish Armada in 1588. The reason for that attack on Queen Elizabeth had to do with Francis Drake and his raiding on the Spanish treasure ships that are bringing gold and silver back. Okay, so Queen Elizabeth dies in 1603 and is replaced by James I. James I is the first Stuart, and he is a kind of a peacemaker. So we don't get, he's the reason that the Virginia is settled and called Virginia, right? He makes peace with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. He makes peace with the Pope, and basically allows British settlers to wedge into that little area in eastern Virginia, Powhatan's kingdom, wedge into there, and it's called Virginia after the Virgin Queen, right? Queen Elizabeth died without children that we know of, and so that the monarchy ends and is replaced by the Stuarts. Being so fanatical that even the Dutch can't tolerate your beliefs, right? So then James I is a peacemaker. Charles I, who comes after him, right? He's the second Stuart, is an incredibly difficult person, right? Charles I comes to the throne in 1625. He is not even popular with his family. They would throw bread at him and stuff like that around the table. and constantly make fun of him. He had regular conflicts with the House of Commons, which tried to limit his ability to declare war and raise taxes. And so what he does is he's a historian. He scours the record books for taxes, tries to figure out ways of taxing British subjects. He creates a tax on any man with wealth, claiming that they have to pay a knight's tax, because he finds in the 7th century some document that says everyone who has, a certain amount of wealth has to either fight for the king or pay the king. And so he creates this knight's tax. He also creates, what's it called? It was in the previous slide that got destroyed, the ship tax, which was a tax that had gone back to, Knight, knight, a knight's tax. So basically, anybody who had something like over £100 in wealth, which was quite a bit in the 1600s, had to pay a knight's tax to Charles I. He also created a ship tax, which ship money it was called, which was to pay for sailing ships. Now, in the 9th or 10th century, long before Charles, it made sense to pay for ships to defend Britain against, say, France or the Holy Roman Empire. What Charles I decides to do is to charge inland cities that are way far inland, that have no coastline, aren't even connected to rivers, and charge them a ship's tax to support ships. And meanwhile, at the time, Britain is having no wars. So there's a tremendous opposition to Charles I. And he convenes Parliament in 1640. He tries not to deal with Parliament, but because Parliament is composed of the lords and the other citizens who might resent his taxes, he convenes Parliament where he asks for funds to prosecute the war against Scotland. They refuse, and he does look a little bit like Britney Spears. They refuse, and he dissolves the Parliament, and he continues an invasion. And this is the first of the Bishops' Wars. And the Bishops' Wars, and I had a great image, and I've lost it. Oh, I can't believe my luck here. I don't know what's going on with that. But the Bishops' War is basically Scotland. The Book of Common Prayer is being imposed on Scotland. People in Scotland oppose the Book of Common Prayer. They think it's a popish thing. And so they throw things, including their seats, at the ministers of the Anglican Church who are supporting the Book of Common Prayer. And so the Scottish lords then kind of rise up against Charles I. And this is the reason he convenes Parliament. But Parliament, they opposed his, funds to invade Scotland. They don't oppose the taxes so much as they oppose, although they are complaining about the taxes, it's really a kind of religious quarrel about whether a kind of British version of the Bible is going to be used or not. He did it again. And so they refuse. He dissolves the Parliament. He continues his invasion. And when the Presbyterian Scots invade Britain in the summer of 1640, he's forced to call the Parliament again. And this is the Long Parliament. Shortly afterwards, there's a rebellion in Ireland in 1641. Okay, so this is called the War of the Three Kings, I think. It's basically England, Scotland, and Ireland are at war. Ireland is mostly Catholic. Scotland is mostly Presbyterian. King Charles I is Anglican. And so it's partly a religious war, partly a cultural war. Parliament issues a grand remonstrance to King Charles I, summarizing their grievances. And the king then tries to invade Parliament. And this is the beginning of the English Civil War. All these great images I had. So the English Civil War pits Protestant warriors on the left, people who are Puritans, against cavaliers here on the right. And again, Protestants distinguished by their short haircuts, their hats, often with pointy beards. They or the stances. And they create their own parliament. Long Parliament creates its own army. Oliver Cromwell is the head of that army. And it's totally different. The Oliver Cromwell's army, and this is important for understanding the American colonies, It has educated officers. It has educated troops. So they issue something called the Soldier's Catechism, which is written in English, which tells soldiers what their jobs are. It tells them that they have to support God over the king. The 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 New Model Army would chanted verses from he was the head of the Puritans, the roundheads. Cromwell was. Cavaliers were supporters of Charles I. If you think about, I don't know, if you've heard about the Virginia Cavaliers, UVA, right? That's because Virginia supported Charles I, and you can tell that that person on the right is from UVA, right? He's about to strut down a one-way. You've heard of the UVA. So I taught at William and Mary for a while. They hated University of Virginia. The UVA handshake is. Sorry, that's the UVA handshake. They're called the Who's, but they also call themselves the Cavaliers. They're the supporters of Charles I. This New Model Army had educated officers, educated troops. They chanted verses from the Bible when they attacked. They had amazing supply lines, unlike the Cavaliers. They had disciplined cavalry charges. They would fine soldiers for drinking and hang them for looting. That's what the New Model Army was. In 1648, I had a great image of the execution of Charles I, but I don't have it. It's basically his head's cut off. The New Model Army under Cromwell, they cut Charles I's head off. They basically charge him with crimes against the English state, and they Puritans versus Cavaliers, Puritans versus Charles I. The Puritans basically cut off Charles I's head. The Model Army purges Parliament of the Presbyterians who might support Charles. The new Parliament has the king executed. They abolish the monarchy, the House of Lords, and the Anglican Church. Okay, so this is a radical transformation of Great Britain, right? And it's basically at the head of this group of people who call themselves Puritans. And so when we think of the Puritans as being sort of the outcasts of England, that's often how we tell the story of the United States, as Puritans and Pilgrims and others who were kicked out of Britain and settled in these regions. No, in the 1640s, the Puritans run England. They control England. They've executed Charles I. So in 1649, though, so this is they believe that Charles I is a sort of illegitimate criminal. They execute him. Cromwell's army, though, doesn't stop in putting down the Charles I. Cromwell then moves on to Ireland, which is Catholic, and invades the towns of Drogheda and Wexford. Put it in chat. Drogheda and Wexford. Okay. He doesn't allow looting, right? This is the New Model Army. He lays siege to the town. Once the town has surrendered, he takes all the people who surrendered and massacres them. Everyone, men, women, and children. He rounds up all the priests and massacres them. 1,500 to 2,000 people are killed in cold blood at Wexford. This is in Ireland. This is unprecedented warfare. Yeah, right, exactly. No looting, but massacres are okay. Cromwell writes back after the destruction of Wexford, after the execution of and the massacre of the people who surrendered, and he says now Wexford would be a good place for Englishmen to settle. Why does he do this? Because they're Catholic, because they're supporters of the Pope, and many of the people in the New Model Army are Fifth Monarchy men. They believe that there should be a kind of holy war against Catholics, and and because they're Catholics, they can't. They're agents of the devil, and they need to be executed. This was Cromwell. This is Cromwell and his New Model Army. He's called Lord Cromwell. He refuses to take the term king, but he becomes the Lord Protector of Great Britain. Okay, so this is Cromwell. He says there's almost no one here in Ireland now, in Wexford. He's successful at putting down this insurrection. Okay, so Puritans in Britain were terrifying, right? They would gather in an Anglican church, for example, demolish all the stained glass windows. And so they do this in places like Norwich and Norfolk. Rip up the communion table, put it in the center of the church, and then gather around and hang the parish minister. Okay, so that is what the New Model Army was about. It was educated. They were Christians. They read the Bible constantly. They quoted the Bible constantly, but they were also brutal in their attacks on both the Anglican Church initially and the Catholic Church. Yeah, those are the two cities that Cromwell took over in Ireland, Drogheda and Wexford. Okay, so what effect does the Protestant Reformation have in Great Britain? It's got a massive effect. It drastically changes Britain. We can't really understand Cromwell and his New Model Army. Cromwell is again basically he's the head of the New Model Army who becomes the Lord Protector, the closest thing to a king in Great Britain. In the middle of the 17th century, yeah, we're men of God and then commit war crimes, exactly. And the filtering down of the Protestant Reformation, he was a Puritan. What was Cromwell's rating for invading? Yes, religion. In part because there was a rebellion in 1641 in Ireland against initially against Charles I, but in putting it down, Cromwell believed that Irish Catholics should be eliminated. Okay. So it's the middle of the 17th century, the filtering down of the Protestant Reformation. There's a tremendous flowering of different kinds of religion in England. And all right, I'm going to bear with me here for a second. I am so irritated that I've lost all my slides, but I am going to design slide size widescreen. All right. We talked a little bit about Scotland, and basically, sorry, that's my image. That's a much better. I had a much better image of Charles I's execution in 1649. And all of my images are gone. Here we are. This is the image that I wanted to show you. All right, this is the catalog of the sects and opinions of England and other nations with a brief rehearsal of their false and dangerous tenets. Okay, there's another side to the Puritans. In the middle of the 17th century, with the coming of capitalism and the filtering down of the Protestant Reformation, we see tremendous debate about what's in the Bible. The Bible is translated into English and other languages, into Dutch, and people believe that they can interpret the Bible for themselves growing out of this Reformation. There are all kinds of different religions flowering in the 17th century. There are levelers, there are Quakers, there are Grindletonians, there are Fifth Monarchy men who believe that the world would end in 1666 because the number of the beast was 666. There were familists. There were who believed that all the families of religion were the same. There were people who carried around the prophecies of Merlin in their back pocket and used the prophecies of Merlin to fight people off. So this is a kind of crazy flowering of religion in the 17th century, in the period of the English Civil War. And Cromwell does these horrible things, but in a way, he's not the most radical person by far in Britain. It's the Fifth Monarchy men who grow out of this New Model Army that are much more radical than him. Let's see if I can find. Okay, this is an image of the New Model Army, just to kind of give you a sense of how they looked and sort of how they operated. They would read these Bibles on the. I don't usually take this long to do this, but I'm just rebuilding my. Okay, and here's the Soldier's Catechism, composed of the Parliament's Army, and this was taught. So basically, the army was taught to read, which is a radical innovation. first of all. The New Model Army is incredibly disciplined, and so it doesn't loot, but it kills on behalf of religion. The Soldier's Catechism teaches people the parts of the Bible. This is where the Fifth Monarchy men are emerging, and the Fifth Monarchy men are the most radical Puritans who believed that God's army was on their behalf. They called themselves supporters of King Jesus, and that King Jesus was their only king. Right. So this is another side to the Puritans. They are not like us. They read the Bible all the time. They thought of God as being immanent. That is, in every action and everything that you saw was God's hand, right? So every stick on the ground was a symbol from God to you about how you should organize your life, right? There was a sense of some people who were these connected to the English Civil War, and I want to again remind you how radical this war is. The people in the English Civil War said that bear with me, that they were more important than the prophets, because Moses, for example, who got down the Ten Commandments, only saw Moses's back. But some of these people said that they saw God regularly, then saw his face 2 or 3 times, and God had instructed them, these things. So this is how radical this sort of Reformation is in Great Britain. It brings about a collapse of the government, the destruction of the king, a total refashioning of British society. And they're not humanitarians, these folks, right? They're Christians. They're devout Christians, but they're not humanitarians. There's a sense of godliness that was democratic, that other people had access to God, but it often extended only to people like themselves, not to the Irish, who they killed at Drogheda and Wexford, not to the Indians. Killed them so they stopped sinning. So we associate the Puritans with religious freedom, but as many of you pointed out in the Packback things, they were, of course, they kept kicking each other out, right? So opponents of the Puritans were forced out into New Haven and to Rhode Island and these other places. Puritans and Pilgrims and others were. So I speak from great experience about this. Not great experience, but some experience about this, because these are my family's people. My name's Scott Nelson. My seventh great grandfather was John Nelson, and he may have been the person who cut off Charles I's head. After he survived and escaped in 1660, after the English Revolution, he settled in New Amsterdam. He lived an assumed name, and he named his children Nisach, Shadrach, and Abednego. This is a sort of right. No one knows who actually cut off Charles I's head. And there are King's Heads taverns where people have claimed to do them. But these are people who believe that they were descended from God, and right. Unfortunately, there's for 20 years people were chasing after people like my seventh great grandfather who settled in New Jersey and took New Amsterdam and took an assumed name. Lots of the people after Charles II came back to the throne. So Charles I is executed, replaced by Cromwell briefly in the English Civil War, and then Charles II is invited to come back as king. And Charles II and agents of Charles II go all around the world looking for anybody who is involved in the execution of Charles I, and they not only kill them, but they draw and quarter them. They basically tie a horse to each limb and pull them apart. And so this was the fate of anybody who was suspected of having killed Charles I. And the person who killed Charles I had a mask on. Right. So these are the Puritans. They are not, the kind of image that you probably got in school about, kindly, happy people. This is the real background to settlement. Jamestown was founded in 1607 under James I. But by the 1630s, there were only 500 people in Jamestown. Many were killed off by disease. The English Civil War sends a lot of people over to the New World who are on one side or the other of this conflict. The simmering battles between radical Protestantism of the Puritans, which is associated with shopkeepers, artisans, and farmers on the one hand, and then the royalist Anglicans associated with the king, is important to understand some of the differences between the North and the South. Okay, so in 1861, Union soldiers said that the American Civil War that had just begun, what they called it the War of the Rebellion at the time, was actually the English Civil War fought 200 years later. Why would that be? Why would you claim? Why would a Union soldier claim that the American Civil War is just the English Civil War all over again? What's in this very quick description of what I've described of this? Right. So part of it is that the Cavaliers settle in the South and the Puritans settle in the North. So if we're looking at white people, anyways, it's the people who supported the King, Charles II. They are the ones who settled Georgia. They're the ones who settled South Carolina. It was called Carolina then. They're the ones who settled in Virginia. It's also these are the sort of radical religious folks who become anti-slavery people. And so some people in the Union Army believed that the Union Army was just a sort of resurrection of this older Puritan tradition of sort of breaking apart societies that are unacceptable. If you think about the flamboyant generals in the Confederate Army, they look very much like this guy on the right, with the feathers in their caps, riding on horses, Jubal Early, General Longstreet, all of the other kind of Confederate generals, and the kind of images of themselves are very much alike. The religious folks were generally against slavery, although it's that said, New England participated in the slave trade, but there were not many enslaved people in New England. Cottagecore. I barely understand what cottagecore is. Okay, so that's what this environment is about. So let me just talk about some where the English Civil War ends up and how we understand the regions of the Americans, the United States. So I think we can lump together the lower South. That would be South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia in this period. With the Chesapeake, which is Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. Why? Because both of those regions are producing staple crops that are going to be useful and valuable to the British. They're not producing much cotton in this period. The lower South is producing indigo and rice to feed enslaved people in the Caribbean plantations. The Chesapeake is producing initially food and naval stores, that is like wood and stuff like that, and tar and pitch for ships, but also crucially tobacco. Right, and so the Royalist Anglicans settle in New England. The land that's no Royalist Anglicans settled in New England. The Royalist Anglicans settled in the South. The Royalist Anglicans, they're the people who get massive land grants in Carolina. So these are people who are close to Charles II, and they get basically 800 or 1,000 acres. So when we think about the origins of the large plantations in the American South, a lot of them are the descendants of these cavaliers who supported Charles II. Those families end up with fairly large plantation holdings. And they are ultimately going to buy enslaved people to settle on those plantations. So that's the background for many of those folks. That said, okay, so that's the Chesapeake and the Lower South. Jamestown was settled with 144 men and women. 40 of them died on the way. 66 of them died over the next 8 months. It left 38 people behind. So we can't generalize about Jamestown. The British Empire was generally not too bright. Every time the settlers tried to move inland, some colonial official from England would arrive and tell them to move back into the swamps, where they would die of all sorts of diseases. Who settles the southern colonies? It's joint stock companies that are interested in a return on investment, and Virginia is settled first. But those who invested in the Virginia Company and received the land charter from the crown tended to be people who were close to Charles II. Okay, so they hoped to get returns from gold and other minerals, initially by raiding the Spanish treasure ships. They hoped to produce wine, citrus fruits, and olive oil. Why would you? Why would that be the initial plan to settle South Carolina and say Eastern Virginia? Why would the plan be to produce wine, citrus fruits, and olive oil? Oh, yeah, because they taste good. It's also climate, right? So this is further south than England, and so these are the goods. It's for food preservation. Excellent. So wine is preserved grapes. Citrus fruit actually does preserve things. Olive oil is also good for preservation. It's all the things that are being produced by the Holy Roman Empire, right? By Spain, by France. They were luxury good items to a certain extent, but there were also things that were being produced outside of England. And so the idea was to look for a place in the New World that would produce the goods on England. Yeah, so citrus does prevent scurvy, so it's good on ships. In fact, that's why British people are called limeys, is because the British sailors would suck limes after they got off ships. Romans happy to trade with the English. Italy was happy to trade with the English, but Italy was at this point controlled by the Holy Roman Empire. And so that, again, remember, Britain was at war with the Holy Roman Empire. And so it was an attempt to sort of break away from the dependence on those regions, areas around Rome and places like that. Okay. The Virginia Company that tries to settle Virginia and then South Carolina, the Carolina Company, both of them skirt bankruptcy again and again, even after tobacco is developed. They institute a royally sanctioned lottery to keep going, and they create a system of particular plantations with special grants of land and political power to large landowners. Promoters gave them exotic names like Berkeley, Bermuda, and Flower Dew Hundred. And so this is where we get plantations from, is those people on the right. People who were cavaliers, people who supported Charles I, and then supported Charles II when he returned to the throne, and they are rewarded with huge grants of land in the Carolinas and Virginia. This is Virginia's 1%. All right. This is not most of the settlers, but this is the people who kind of run things, are cavaliers and other people like them. Yeah, they have special political rights. They're nobles and adventurers who got huge tracts of land. Remembering that Europe was still a largely feudal society, these men were associated with the courtiers around the crown. Okay, people who sucked up to the king. Land in Virginia and South Carolina was parceled out to gangs of men who were close to the king and later close to the royal governor who was established in South Carolina or Georgia. They never found gold. Took years to get anything from the forest and the soil. Part of the reason for the failure is that they tried to master the local Indians, tried to enslave them, but the Powhatans were much better at holding back the English. Okay, the people who settle, the white people who settle in the South, death rates are massive, incredibly high death rates. There are also very few women who come over to these regions. And what we see is then very low birth rates. Death rates were high in the South Carolina, in the American South, because of warm weather and swampy soil that produce mosquitoes. Mosquitoes transmitted, they didn't know it at the time, malaria. You could get dysentery in these swampy regions, and also yellow fever. They basically fought for the king. So in the English Civil War from 1642 to 1646 is basically armed troops on the side of Charles I against armed troops on the side of the Parliament, on the side of Cromwell, on the side of the Puritans. And so the people who supported Charles I by summoning up armies and by organizing people to fight the Puritans, those people are rewarded when Charles II comes back to his throne. Charles II actually saw his father's head cut off. It sort of scarred him for life. And anyone who had been associated with the opposition to Puritan power Charles II gave, just handed over everything that he had, including all of the much of the land that was available for him to give away in South Carolina. Okay. They also brought smallpox, diphtheria, and other viruses to the New World, which thrived in the New World and then killed more and more people. The ratio of men to women was 3.5 to 1. So 3.5 men for every woman. Thus, many men never married. Nearly all women did. It also meant that many women married more than twice. Lots of men, relatively few women. It's not bad. Okay. No women. That's why I failed. The low birth rates were in the South, the American South. So very low birth rates. And that's because of very few women, lots of men living mostly together. If you just imagine a region founded by fraternities. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, they didn't they didn't have plural husbands, but women were often became widows, and then they would remarry. That meant that a lot of the wealth that tended to concentrate among white women in Virginia and South Carolina. So many men never married. Many women married more than twice. But imagine this society of lots of men, age 18 to 25, living mostly together. Imagine just a frat house. Exactly. This is a frat house. Okay. If you've been to a frat house, you know that it's not the cleanest place in the world. The southern colonies were also extremely violent places, in part for this reason. If we look at criminal records, which is one of the ways that we have of trying to figure out 17th century society, there were lots of thefts, lots of assaults, lots of political violence, uprisings, riots, and even full-scale rebellions. Next class, I'll talk about Bacon's rebellion, but it's helpful to understand that there are constant rebellions in the South because of this lopsided sex ratio, in part. Okay, so that's the court's time was focused on violent crimes and property crimes. There were no attempts to enforce any kind of moral standards in South Carolina. So, for example, Maryland prosecuted only one person for fornication, that's premarital sex, in the entire 17th century. Although 1/3 of all immigrant brides were pregnant on their wedding day. So the capacity of the courts was so taken over with dealing with assault and violent crime that they couldn't that they didn't emphasize moral crimes at all. They didn't marry native women. They didn't tend to intermarry, although some of the important plantation families did marry native people. So, for example, famously, Thomas Jefferson was supposedly descended from Pocahontas. So there was some intermarriage between Powhatans and British settlers. But by and large, many of these men are there to make a fortune. They don't quite make a fortune. A lot of them die of diphtheria and yellow fever and other goods. So that's a great question about how land is distributed. There was something called femme couvert, which I'll spell it, which it's a French term, and it describes the sort of way in which a woman was viewed as a kind of child of the husband, but that said, somebody was on the land. The property might be doled out to children if there wasn't a will. So it basically put women in a position of power, particularly if they have young boys who are children. They effectively controlled the wealth until the boys married or something like that. So and it was possible to sign prenuptial agreements and things like that. There were a lot of these in South Carolina that ensured that women got the wealth. So you imagine a wealthy planter, say in South Carolina, has a daughter and no sons. He's going to ensure that the man who marries his daughter isn't going to get everything. and the grandkids are going to be helped or something like that. And so there are all sorts of legal ways in which, in South Carolina in particular, where women are able to hold property and carry it on to children. Major Bridgerton wives. Okay, I think that's a reference to a television show. I don't watch. Yeah. Okay. So that's the social order is imbalanced sex ratio, lots of assaults, lots of political violence. Economy. The 7th century Southern settlers wanted land. And the Chesapeake, the lower South, and the Caribbean had one thing in common, and that was warm weather. They are able to grow eventually crops that are desired in the New World. In Chesapeake, it's tobacco. So Maryland and Virginia, it's tobacco. King Charles I said the second said that Virginia was founded upon smoke. The lower South was rice and indigo. North Carolina was lumber and naval stores. But it was extractive and dangerous work. Most people would not settle foot on southern colonies willingly unless they were able to make money quickly. Okay, so the 1% of folks who settle in these lands need to figure out a way to get other people to do their work for them. And initially they set up in South Carolina and Virginia and these other places an indentured servitude system where you come over as a young man, you are indentured to a large landowner, you do work for that person for 3 or 4 or 5 years. You're paying off your passage, and at the end, you're handed a rifle and a jacket. Maybe a jacket is no small cost. A jacket was the same price as a house in the 17th century. A jacket was an incredibly expensive device, but you got a jacket, you got a rifle, and you got maybe 50 acres of land from the governor. A headright system was initially formed, and so you have lots and lots of people. Jacket was the price of a house, yeah, in say 1790 or something like that. Why? Because so much labor that goes into making a jacket. We don't see it now, but stapling the wool, attaching it to the linen, all the other stuff that's associated with making a jacket makes it incredibly expensive. So much labor. Okay. So there was no interest in reproducing the experience of peasants in the English countryside. The 1% who settled there were there to grow exotic luxury crops that would sell in English markets and make them rich. So the labor system they brought over was indentured servants. So that's many of the people who then came over. If you have white ancestors who came to the New World, you likely didn't come over with the 1%. You likely came over with folks who were brought over by these people. Indentured white servants. Yeah. So landowners in England. So basically, the jails were emptied out in Britain again and again, and settled. Those people were settled in Virginia and South Carolina. Lots of extra people in England because of the enclosure movement that we saw discussed in the first and the second chapter. Landowners in England. Take a lot of the common land and enclose it and put sheep on them. This cuts into the game and the firewood that's available to peasants, and lots of landless folks on the roads in England in the 17th century, and those people are picked up. Orphanages are basically emptied into Virginia and South Carolina, and so lots and lots of very young people, ages 8 to 14, are brought over and indentured to these cavaliers, these large landowners in Virginia and South Carolina. There is a headright system. No. In fact, there were German indentured servants in Pennsylvania, all the way up until the 1730s and 1740s. We're going to talk a little bit about that, but yeah, there were indentured servants, people who were indentured servants in the North as well. Philadelphia was probably the biggest site for that, but New York actually had indentured servants come over as well. there was a headright system eventually. As it became harder and harder to get people to come over to this region. Some of the best documents that we have from Virginia in the 1630s and 1640s are basically hangman's confessions, where somebody says, "Yeah, I came over as an indentured servant when I was 13. I worked for this crazy guy for 4 years. His wife kept yelling at me, and so I took an axe and I cut her head off, and then I killed him, beat him to death, bloody, and now I'm paying for it." So a lot of there it wasn't there was a tremendous amount of crime connected with indentured servants who were angry about how badly they were treated, and there was a headright system. You could get land. Fortunately for Southern planters, though, very few people could afford to pay their way across the Atlantic. If you could pay your way across the Atlantic, then you got land. But if you couldn't pay your way, and that's how most people, white people, come into the Southern colonies, you ended up as an indentured servant. For the sum of about 6 to 30 pounds, a planter could buy an indentured servant for a period of 4 to 7 years. They traded their freedom. They traded their freedom temporarily for the cost of transportation. The London underworld, though, not all of them went voluntarily. The London underworld developed a flourishing trade in kidnapped children and orphans. England sent also many convicts. About half the white people who came to the colonies from England and continental Europe came as indentured servants. And at the end, they would get freedom dues, some money, a tool or two, some clothing, and some food. Men would get a piece of land and usually a gun. Women were so scarce that most married before their indentures expired. So they didn't get land, they got just some money, some clothes, and maybe some food. The problem with indentured servants is they often ran away, and when they did, they were hard to catch because they could blend in easily in the surrounding population. In fact, North Carolina was basically populated by people who had escaped from Virginia and South Carolina. They didn't forfeit all of their rights as English citizens when they signed their indentured bonds, and they could complain to the courts if their masters mistreated them, underfed them, or held them beyond the indenture period. They also organized and rebelled in the 1600s with what seemed to planters to be alarming frequency. The more settlers came to the colony, the more pressure there was on land that was closest to the good rivers. The higher land prices went. This meant that fewer and fewer servants could afford to buy land with their freedom dues. This became, as a result, an angry, frustrated, and often disorderly group. This is the source of Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion, 1675. We'll talk a little bit more about this on Thursday, but Bacon's Rebellion kind of grows out of this imbalanced sex ratio, and Bacon's Rebellion is going to be a sort of cavalier conflict. Bacon himself was a favored person in for Charles II. He was treated badly by the governor, and he organizes lots of white people to raise up against the governor. Their aim, though, is to kill Indians, right? So it's a very strange kind of rebellion. It begins with a conflict between a planter and a Dogue Indian on the Potomac. A Dogue kills a planter's herdsman. The militiamen then kill 10 or more Dogues by mistake. Then they also kill 14 Susquehannocks. The militia lays siege to a Susquehannock camp. Then 5 chieftains come to negotiate, and the militia kills them. Governor Berkeley proposes establishing forts, stopping the westward settlement. And this is in 1676, the Nathaniel Bacon comes over, and he's the spoiled son of an English landlord. He's tall, slender, 29 years old, and has a hot temper. Bacon says Indians are all alike. Bacon is a cavalier. They're wolves, tigers, and bears who prey upon the settlers, who are lambs. Bacon prepares an all-out war against the Indians. He orders the governor arrested, and he burns Jamestown. Okay, so that's what Bacon's Rebellion is. Now think to the background. Just 10 years earlier, the English Civil War had what you had seen similar conflict, where white people are killing white people over sort of religious issues. But Bacon organizes these men into a colonial militia that threatens the governor, who's appointed by the king. Sorry, I don't have an image from Bacon's Rebellion. I meant to when I did this until my PowerPoint broke down. Bacon dies of swamp fever, and then Berkeley begins an expedition that captures and immediately hangs people who are associated with Bacon, hanging 23 of them. The governor was trying to make peace with the Indians, and Bacon didn't like this. Bacon said, "There's not enough land." And it does sound terrible. And he's got, he believes that he and all these other people should be getting land that the Wampanoags and the Dogs have. The Susquehannocks and the Dogs have. And so he thinks that Governor Berkeley shouldn't negotiate with him. And so he organizes this militia to kill basically stop the governor and to take the land for themselves. Okay, so let's look at this map here. Here's Europe's view, or Britain's view, in the 1600s. Let's call it Britain. These are unimportant places. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, even New Jersey. Those are the places where you dump off religious protesters and things like that. That's where you dump off Puritans and Pilgrims and others. They don't matter. Oh, sorry, Emily. Well, this will be on YouTube, so I'll post. It'll be posted probably at the end of the day today. We're in Bacon's Rebellion now. Okay, the important places, as Britain saw it, was not Georgia and South Carolina and these other places. It was here. It was the Caribbean. That's where the sugar was being produced. That's where slavery was most strongest. That's where enslaved people had been brought over to produce sugar and tobacco and coffee. Those are the three things that those Caribbean islands. And that's what Britain was focused on. And to the extent that they cared about Virginia and South Carolina, it was basically as a way to feed the colonies, to feed the Caribbean. Okay, after 1675, Governor Berkeley and others, so Governor Berkeley is eventually deposed, but the solution in Virginia becomes slavery. Okay, the solution of all this indentured servitude conflict is African slavery. African slavery became entrenched early on in the Caribbean colonies, sugar colonies in the 1640s and 1650s, where land was held exclusively in large tracts by people close to the king. Indentured servants could not be enticed to go to the Caribbean colonies because they didn't have any chance of getting land at the end of their bondage. By 1675, the English West Indies had over 100,000 enslaved Africans. In the southern mainland colonies, on the other hand, there were fewer than 5,000. So just a few African enslaved people in this period. And some of them were indentured servants. Famously, you probably remember that Obama's seventh great grandfather was an African indentured servant who got his freedom and got his own land in Virginia in the 1670s. And so there were African indentured servants. There were, slavery as a system didn't really exist before or fully exist in Virginia before Bacon's Rebellion. But after Bacon's Rebellion, after 1675, we see Southern planters turning increasingly to enslaved people imported from West Africa. That rebellion is the turning point in Virginia towards African slavery. After Bacon's Rebellion, 10,000 enslaved people were brought by planters in the southern mainland colonies. By the American Revolution, 245,000 had been imported. And unlike to a certain extent, enslaved people did come from the Caribbean. So in 1619, probably the first Africans arrived, possibly as enslaved people in Virginia. We don't have very good records, but those people came from the Caribbean. Basically, so there were Native Americans who were enslaved. The Germans were indentured servants. Why were Africans enslaved people in the majority? It's hard. Part of it is the difference in these societies. So in the Caribbean, if you were an enslaved person, if you were captured in Africa and transported to the Caribbean, the likelihood that you would survive and have children was very small. So this is the horrible brutality of African enslavement in the Caribbean, is that you were very unlikely to have children, and you were very likely to die just to be replaced by another enslaved person. What we see in Virginia and North Carolina is in part because it's not as tropical, those regions, and even in Georgia, they're not as tropical in part for those regions, that African people are able to have children who are enslaved, but they do survive. And so there's 245,000 total enslaved people who are brought into the Caribbean colonies, into say Georgia to Virginia, up to the Revolution, but that becomes, over a million by 1776 because many of them have descendants and have children. African slavery has, so yeah, so da, 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 da. Yeah, 245,000 people had been imported from Africa in by the time of the Revolution. By the end of the 17th century, Southern colonies were slave societies. Not just places where slaves were owned, but societies that were dependent on and shaped around the presence of an enlarged slave population. New York had been that briefly in the 1630s and 1640s, but New York City and the area around it increasingly became societies with slaves. So there were societies in which there were enslaved African people, but they were a minority of the population. In the American South, though, those places are slave societies in which everything, so much of the labor is done by enslaved Africans. In retrospect, Bacon's Rebellion suggests why Virginia planters turned from one society to another. Okay, on Thursday, we're going to talk about New England. So just to back up, I said, what effect does the English Civil War have on this? Well, the English Civil War creates two parties that are pitted against one another. Cavaliers on the left here, who are associated with Charles I and then Charles II after he's returned. Roundheads, who are Puritans and other critics of the king, critics of the monarchy, and things like that on the right. New England is going to get most of these people. And the American South is going to get these people. Now, they're not the majority of the population. They're the kind of 1%. They're the people who settle in these regions and get these land grants. And they are the people who are going to bring enslaved Africans to the New World. So how is this revolution important? The English Revolution is it creates a sort of new kind of society. Simmering battles between radical Protestants of the Puritans and the Royalist Anglicans helps us understand the differences between the North and the South. Northern colonies tended to attract Puritans and Pilgrims. Southern colonies were attractive to Loyalists, who then brought in indentured servants and brought in enslaved Africans. The official Church of England was the Anglican Church. Virginia was a very strongly Anglican society in that sense. We'll talk about the New England colonies, and we'll talk a little bit about slavery on Thursday. Are there questions?